Have you ever walked into a bookstore and seen that shelf? You know the one. It's packed with all these different versions of the Bible. You've got the King James, the NIV, the ESV. The list just goes on and on. And you might think, wait, aren't they all the same book? Well, the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. So let's get into it and uncover the really fascinating story behind why one of the most important books ever written has so many different voices. Just look at this right here. This is the very first line of the super famous Psalm 23. On the left, you have the classic King James Version, I shall not want. And on the right, the New International Version, I lack nothing. Now, the core idea is pretty much the same, right? But the words themselves are definitely different. And this small difference, well, it's the tip of a very big iceberg that we're about to explore.
So, this gets us to the big question for this whole explainer. Why? Why don't we just have one single standard Bible? The answer, it turns out, is a journey that's going to take us back thousands of years, across different ancient languages, and deep into the very tricky art of translation itself.
To solve this mystery, we have to start at the very beginning. And I don't mean the first English Bible. Nope. We have to go back to the original source documents because, and this is key, the Bible was never written in English to begin with.
You see, the collection of books we call the Bible was written over centuries by a ton of different people. The Old Testament was almost entirely written in Hebrew, with just a few bits in a related language called Aramaic. The New Testament, on the other hand, was written in what's called Koine Greek, which was the everyday language spoken around the Mediterranean back then. So right off the bat, every single English Bible you've ever seen is a translation. Now, for the Old Testament, the primary source that translators use is called the Masoretic text. Think of this as the authoritative Hebrew version. It was painstakingly copied and preserved by Jewish scribes for centuries, and they had this incredible system of checks and balances to make sure no errors crept in. It's the bedrock for pretty much every Protestant Old Testament.
But that's not the only ancient version floating around. Hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. This version is called the Septuagint, and it became a really big deal. It was the Bible that most of the early Greek-speaking Christians were reading, and it even includes some books that aren't in the Masoretic text, books that Protestants later called the Apocrypha. Then for the New Testament, the early English translators, like the ones who made the King James Version, were relying on this, the Textus Receptus, which is just Latin for received text. It was a Greek text put together in the 1500s by a famous scholar named Erasmus. But here's the catch. He based it on just a few Greek manuscripts he had access to, and most of them were from the 12th century or even later. Now I want you to file that little detail away, because the age of these documents becomes a huge part of our story later on. Okay, so we've got different source texts. That explains some of it, but that's only part of the story. The next huge reason for all these different versions is the sheer challenge of translation. You know, it's not just about swapping out a Hebrew word for an English one. It's way more of an art than a science. Every translator has to make a big choice right at the start. Do you go for a word-for-word approach? That's what we call formal equivalence. You try to stick as close as you possibly can to the original grammar and phrasing. Or do you aim for a thought-for-thought translation? That's functional equivalence, where the main goal is just to get the original meaning across in a way that sounds natural in modern English. And that one choice creates this massive spectrum of Bibles, from super literal on one end to super readable on the other. To really see how this all plays out in the real world, let's zoom in on the most famous, most influential English translation of all time, the King James Version. Its story is the perfect example of the ambition to create one single, definitive Bible for an entire nation. Now, the KJV didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was really built on the work of some brave pioneers. You had Wycliffe's Bible way back in the 1300s, which had to be copied by hand. Then there was William Tyndale's New Testament, the first to be printed in English, a revolutionary act that actually cost him his life. By the time King James came along, the most popular version was called the Geneva Bible, but it had all these study notes in the margins that were, let's just say, not very friendly to the idea of an all-powerful king. So, in 1604, King James I of England comes up with this grand plan. He commissions 54 of the country's absolute best scholars and church leaders for one epic project to create a single, authoritative English Bible that everyone could use, one that would finally unite all the competing factions in the church. And the process they used was unbelievably rigorous. They split into 6 different committees, and they were told to use a previous translation, called the Bishop's Bible, as their starting point. They would then review each other's work, debating every single word choice to craft a text that was not only scholarly and accurate, but also sounded beautiful and majestic when read aloud. It was a massive undertaking, totally unprecedented. The results of all that work was an absolute masterpiece, but its influence exploded way beyond the church walls. The King James Bible actually became one of the cornerstones of the modern English language, shaping how we talk and write today in ways we don't even realize. But here's a fun fact that most people don't know. The King James Bible that you'd buy in a store today is not exactly the same one that came off the printing press in 1611. Back then, spelling and punctuation were all over the place. The version that became the standard we all know and recognize was actually a major update done at Oxford in 1769, where they cleaned up and modernized thousands of little inconsistencies. So just how big was its impact on our language? Well, a linguist named David Crystal actually went through and counted. He traced at least 257 common English phrases and idioms directly back to the King James Bible. To put that in perspective, that's more than double the number of phrases that Shakespeare gave us. And you know these phrases, I guarantee it. Ever said you escaped a situation by the skin of your teeth? That's not from some old play. That's straight out of the book of Job in the King James Version. Or what about describing something that's a constant, nagging problem as a thorn in the flesh? Yep, you guessed it. That comes from the Apostle Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, thanks to the KJV translators. Or calling a really good, decent person the salt of the earth. That's from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. The language of the KJV is so deeply woven into our culture that we're all quoting it, a lot of the time without having a clue. So if the King James Version was this huge success and shaped our entire language, you might be wondering, why didn't we just stop there? Why keep making new ones? Well, because an awful lot has happened in the last 400 years. Remember that detail I asked you to file away about the Textus Receptus being based on later manuscripts? Well, since the 1600s, archaeologists have found treasure troves of much, much older biblical texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave us Hebrew manuscripts that were 1,000 years older than what the KJV translators had. For the New Testament, we now have incredible finds like the Codex Sinaiticus, which dates all the way back to the 4th century. So modern translators aren't just giving it a fresh coat of paint. They're working from a textual foundation that's older and closer to the original. And all of this leads us to the amazing range of options we have today, each with a different goal in mind. You have the poetic but difficult word-for-word KJV, which reads at about a 12th grade level. Then you have something like the NIV, a thought-for-thought translation that aims for a much easier 7th grade reading level. And in between, you have versions like the ESV or the super-literal NASB, which try to hit that sweet spot between accuracy and modern English. It really is a whole spectrum of choices. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Is there a single, best, or most correct Bible? The answer is no, not really. The goal isn't to find the one perfect version. Instead, think of each translation as a different lens, giving you a slightly different but still valuable view of the same ancient writings. Honestly, the best Bible version is the one that speaks to you, the one you'll actually open up and read. And that leaves us with one final, big idea to chew on. The Bible was written down in ancient languages that are more or less frozen in time, but we read it in our own languages, which are alive and constantly changing. And if our language is always evolving, it begs the question, is the work of translating this book ever really finished?